In this episode of Ask Dr. Zach,
he was actually checked by a couple of friends who are doctors, and they all said he's got the flu, no big deal. The next morning, I found him upstairs, and he had had a massive heart attack.
And later,
and it's like as if a sword pierced it, like right through. Whenever I would tell the family doctor about it, she would say, "Oh, don't worry about it. Enough is enough, and I'd like to find a good answer to this quickly."
Now it's time to ask Dr. Zach.
In the ER, I deal with trauma and life-threatening situations every day. I've seen it all. I know firsthand that accurate medical advice can save lives. I'm Dr. Zach, and I'm passionate about empowering people to take control of their own health. This is your chance to ask me health questions. No question too big, no question too small. Welcome, everybody, to Ask Dr. Zach.
Today on Ask Dr. Zach, we're going to focus on one major organ, your heart. Did you know that heart disease is the #1 killer of men and women in North America, with chest pain being one of the most common complaints that brings people to the nearest hospital? But before we ask Dr. Zach about heart disease, let's start by showing you how an artery blockage happens. This is an incredible 3D scan of real human data known as the visual MD.
Because every one of our organs is fed by the blood vessels. What we often call heart disease is actually a disease that affects every inch of our bodies.
Literally any artery that is pumping blood is suspect for blockages. It's kind of like you get a clogged fuel line and the carburetor and the engine aren't going to work. Well, that's exactly what a blockage does. A blockage doesn't allow the motor to work properly.
If these blockages occur in the arteries that supply the heart or the brain, the results are all too familiar catastrophes: heart attack or stroke. But even much subtler disturbances can have disastrous consequences. A seemingly minor increase in blood pressure can start a chain of events that ends in organ failure.
Just think about it like blood rushing out of a fire hydrant. That kind of pressure hitting something hurts. It's damaging. It can cause different kinds of damages to whatever organ it hits.
When we come back, is it heartburn or heart attack?
Like as if somebody threw a dart or something in it, and it's just kind of like a burning, sharp thing, and it disappears quickly.
Mary gets to ask Dr. Zach this burning question she's wanted answered for years. That's all coming up next. Heart disease is now the #1 killer of women, causing more deaths than all cancers combined. And yet many women don't realize that heart disease is one of their greatest health threats. For years, 67-year-old Mary Ponigvar claims she's had a burning heart feeling, but lately she feels vulnerable to heart disease and wants further clarification.
It's burning, and it's like as if a sword pierced it, like right through, right in there. I get pains in my heart, and whenever I would tell the family doctor about it, she would say, "Oh, don't worry about it." And I could never get anything out of her. In the end, it seems it's basically gas related, but it just seemed like, why is it attacking the heart? Right in here, and it's stabbing, sharp pain, and it lasts about 3 seconds. And at the beginning, it used to scare me, something fierce. Being brought up in a very strict European environment, we were always taught to respect professional people, so I never had the courage to actually quiz the doctor. Like in this day and age, everybody's really into getting answers. There we go, a little bit of cream. When we were 7 and whatever years old, we were sitting together at a communion breakfast. So 13 years later, my My husband and I like to dance, and we're into polkas and whatever, and I find when I'm doing something strenuous like that, it doesn't show up. So yes, this can happen at any time. I think it's even happened when I was laying in bed. And actually that was the scariest, because when you're lying in bed and this thing, your heart is hurting, and it's like, uh-oh, you know, am I gonna fall asleep forever?
Now it's time to ask Dr. Zach.
And welcome, Mary. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy you're here as well. So before we get going, actually, I just want to mention a couple of things about the heart, since we have this great model of a heart here.
Oh, okay.
When we talk about a heart attack, what we're really talking about is a blockage of one of the arteries that supplies blood and nutrients and oxygen to the heart. So that's an example is this one. This is the left anterior descending coronary artery, one of the most important. And it supplies blood and nutrients, etc., to the left side of the heart, which is arguably the most important part of the heart. And if there's a blockage there, then that part of the heart is starved for nutrients and it begins to die. And that's what people feel as, that's what people call a heart attack, and that's what people experience as. Typically, and this is where the problem comes in, there's typical symptoms of heart attack and there's atypical symptoms. And the problem is we're much less good at identifying heart attacks in people who have atypical symptoms. And the people who have atypical symptoms are women and people with diabetes, typically. Now, there's a few things about your story that are reassuring. The fact that you can polka, for example, and you don't get the chest pain, that's a good thing, you know, because usually if there's a fixed amount of blockage in an artery, people get angina or chest discomfort when they exert themselves. And a few other things, I mean, you mentioned some other things, including the fact that it tends to be quite localized in terms of one spot in particular.
Right.
That's atypical. It doesn't mean it's not from the heart, but very often chest pain from heart causes are actually they're actually more diffuse. So people get them across the chest, up into their jaw, into their left arm, sometimes into their back. But you know, if it's persisting, then I don't think you should hesitate, if it's still bothering you, to see your doctor. And if you don't have a clear explanation, maybe you do now with the whole gas issue, maybe she has figured it out now. But you know, anyone, and this goes for anyone, if you have a question and there's some symptom that's bothering you, I think it's worthwhile to see your doctor and ask them, you know, can I get a little more of an explanation for what's going on?
Right. My dad had a triple bypass when he was in his early 70s. So I think that was another reason why I was a little concerned about it, because I believe that family history plays a part in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some very important risk factors. One of them is family history, which we can't do anything about.
Right.
Then there's smoking, which we can do something about, and cholesterol and blood pressure, which can be treated. And diabetes, which you know, we can control,
right,
but not, you know, we can't control whether we get it or not necessarily. So family history is important. Now, the fact that he had a bypass in his 70s is actually somewhat reassuring. We worry more about family history, to be honest, if first-degree relative like your dad had heart disease in a male under 55, it's considered sort of a strong family history, and in a woman under 65. So once you're getting into your 70s, it doesn't put you at increased risk. I mean, everyone has risk. You know, we all have risk, our own risk factors, and as we get older, our risk does increase. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're at increased risk, compared to other people.
Right.
Well,
Okay.
I want to thank you so much for joining me.
I'm happy to be here, and I learned what I needed to know, so thank you very much.
Well, I'm very glad. Thanks for coming.
After the break,
911 was called and they came. They sent him directly to the hospital, but it was too late.
struggling to understand why this father and husband dropped dead from a heart attack at 54. All this and more right after this short break. Now, an emotional story of a sudden heart attack for a father of three. David Kendall was just 54 years old with no history of heart disease in his family when he suddenly collapsed and died. His children are now concerned if they are genetically at risk, and his wife Susan wants to know what exactly happened to her otherwise healthy husband.
That's his mother. There's just a whole bunch of us. I mean, he was happy. He was super, oh, that's us. On May 20th of last year. And my 54-year-old husband was at a wedding with me, and he started not feeling well. He was sweating and just a little bit confused. We all thought he had the flu. He was actually checked at the wedding by a couple of friends who are doctors who happened to be there, and they all said he's got the flu, no big deal. He was healthy. I mean, look at him. He's happy, healthy. He'd gone skiing a couple of months earlier with his kids. The next day, he spent most of the day in bed, not feeling well, but getting up, doing some work, and just sort of having a quiet day, which was very unusual for him. The next morning, without notice, I found him upstairs, and he had had a massive heart attack in the morning. We're still coping. It's been a year now. We're taking every day as it comes, and every holiday, every memory, we're trying to make positive. I have 3 children, aged 30, 27, and 22, and my great concern is that their father passed away of a heart attack without any notice in the prime of his life, and also my father happens to also have heart disease. I'm concerned that there may be more that we can do to protect them and to make sure that we're not missing anything.
Now it's time to ask Dr. Zach.
Welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing that story. And anyway, but you have some very poignant questions about, what you could be doing, or especially your kids, in terms of screening them to see if they're at high risk for heart disease or heart attack. And the other thing is, the other thing that really struck me is that you didn't get to talk to the doctors. And that's, that's very hard. The doctors do have a responsibility to discuss things with you and tell you exactly what happened. So if you still haven't had any answers, then I would encourage you to try and get some. There are different ways you can get medical records, especially as, if you're the executor of the estate or...
I am.
Yeah, so then you
Absolutely.
have the right to have the medical records from your husband. Just as any person, I don't know if people know this, but any person has the right to see their own medical records, to have a copy of it, not necessarily the original. Anyway, but talking a little bit about the heart, I think one of the problems in this case, was that his symptom, number one, he was young and healthy. So people just don't think, could this be, are these symptoms maybe of a heart attack? And the other thing is, his symptoms were atypical. He felt, I think you were saying nauseous or dizzy, unwell.
Sweating on the...
Sweating, yeah. So those can be absolutely associated with heart attack, but they can be just the flu. So I think we're not that good at necessarily thinking of those things, unless we're primed. We're primed by people we know have heart disease or have high cholesterol or are older, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, nothing.
Yeah. So now you mentioned that your kids have had some testing done, which I think is appropriate testing, by the way.
Okay.
The screening test that we recommend for just anyone is, as of adulthood, basically, to get some blood tests checked annually or every couple of years for cholesterol and for blood sugar for diabetes, and to get blood pressure checked whenever you see your doctor. Then if there's any added concern, then the other tests that your kids had, like an electrocardiogram, which basically shows, it can show if there's been previous damage to the heart, it can show if there's an electrical problem with the heart, which is a common problem, and it can also show if there's anything happening at that point. But it's just a snapshot. But anyway, that's an important test. And a stress test, which your kids had, which is actually, I know in a lot of sort of executive health programs they do them, but actually they're not recommended as screening tests unless there's a reason to do them. In a healthy 40-year-old, we wouldn't necessarily recommend doing them because there are limitations. There are sometimes false positives or false negatives. But anyway, in the case of your kids, I think it's important.
Oh, so they should do it.
Well, they already did, right?
Right, but
Okay.
to continue.
Good. Yeah, no, that's it. And the other thing about any kind of screening test is very individual, right? So their doctor has to look at their risk factors. So one being now, if this indeed, was a heart attack, then, they're potentially at high risk because they're...
My father also, his whole family is heart disease.
Oh, really? So then
it's even scarier.
Their doctors have to take that into account, and they should be screened for all the risk factors that we talked about. They should try and obviously, do all the right things, eat well, not smoke, exercise. And then further down the line, their doctors may want to do further testing, and other testing are things like echocardiograms, which is an ultrasound looking at the heart. And other tests are things like a coronary calcium scan, which is where it's basically a CAT scan. There's no pain involved, or it's not invasive at all. But they do a CAT scan of the heart, and they take a look at the coronary arteries and they can actually see inside if there's calcification. And that gives them an idea of how much atherosclerosis there is in the coronary arteries. And with that, they can decide whether other things are necessary. So it's just, I think it's very important that you and your kids are in touch regularly with your doctor, and to have these kind of screening tests every year or every 2 years, but also if there's any concerning symptoms, to go into your doctors right away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
When we come back,
Any stage in your life, you can change and improve the health of your heart.
tips on how you can prevent heart disease. Don't get your blood pressure up. We'll be right back. More than 1.4 million Canadians have heart disease. It is also one of the leading causes of death in Canada, claiming more than 33,000 lives per year. You can reduce your risk of developing heart disease and other chronic diseases like cancer by adopting a healthier lifestyle. Here are a few tips to help you get started. First, talk to a healthcare professional about your risk factors for heart disease. Early detection and treatment of high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and diabetes can greatly reduce your risk of developing heart disease. Don't smoke. Smoking damages the lining of your arteries, leading to a buildup of fatty material called atheroma, which narrows the artery. This can cause angina, a heart attack, or a stroke. Exercise. Start by aiming for 30 minutes of moderate physical activity each day. Develop healthy eating habits by following Canada's Food Guide. Eat the recommended daily number of vegetables and fruit servings. Avoid trans fat and limit saturated fats and sodium by choosing fresh, unprocessed foods. Achieve and maintain a healthy weight by adjusting the amount of food you eat. And finally, learn how to cope with stress in a healthy way, such as exercising, listening to music, writing, or spending time with a friend or relative. Now that we know how to prevent and reduce your risks of heart disease, it's time for our studio audience to ask Dr. Zach about any and all of their personal health concerns.
And who's got a question?
I do. How does diabetes affect the heart?
The way that it affects the heart is via the blood vessels. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the coronary arteries, and those are the big blood vessels that supply blood and nutrients and oxygen to the heart. And diabetes, unfortunately, especially over the years, and especially if the sugar control isn't good, so meaning you have an average glucose that's quite high, that puts you at increased risk of atherosclerosis, which means blockage of the arteries. And blockage of the arteries means that it gives you an increased risk of having a heart attack. And so the best thing you can do, though, is to try and have very good control of your glucose, so it's not too high and not too low, and also to maintain a healthy diet and to exercise. Next question.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
How can you tell the difference between stress and a heart attack?
That's a very good question. And the honest answer is we don't always know the difference without doing tests. So because sometimes people come in with chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, nausea, and it ends up being stress. It ends up being an anxiety attack. Sir?
Hello, Dr. Zach.
Hi.
I'm trying to find out what sort of relationship there is between sleep apnea and heart disease.
The reason that there's a relationship is if you stop breathing, even for a few seconds, your oxygen in your blood goes down. And that having not enough oxygen in your blood is straining to all of your body, especially to the areas of your body that really need a lot of oxygen, including the heart, which is constantly working, and the brain. And so if you're doing that many times a night, that is continually putting strain on your heart. And so that can increase your blood pressure and increase your risk of having heart attack over the years.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Next question, please.
Yes, I have a heart murmur, and so does my son. He's in his 40s.
Yes.
I wonder, do I have any concern?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. So, and that's why I'm happy that I'm carrying this heart model here. And I get to open it up, so I'm excited about that too. So basically, what's a heart murmur? It's just an extra sound. When we listen to the heart with a stethoscope, we hear a couple of sounds normally. And sometimes there are extra sounds, and the extra sounds are often from valvular problems. And typically they cause something that's called a murmur. So instead of bump bump, we hear something that's like a swooshing sound. And that means that blood may be flowing a little bit irregularly through one of the valves. Basically, as the blood moves from one chamber to another, it goes through these valves. And they're one-way valves, so blood can only go in one direction. And sometimes these valves get a little bit stenosed, which means they get a little tight, and it's a little bit more difficult for the blood to go through. And sometimes they get a little bit leaky, and the blood can actually back up a bit. This is all interesting information, but it doesn't answer your question. And your question is it something to worry about if you had to have a heart murmur? And the answer is not always. It really varies. So some heart murmurs are totally benign. And now, in order to know that, the doctor has to listen, and sometimes, often in fact, the doctor will want to do other tests, either an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound to look at the heart, or an electrocardiogram to see exactly what's causing the murmur. But sometimes they are serious. What's especially serious and worrisome often is if an adult were to develop a sudden heart murmur. They never had one, and then at the age of 75, they come in, they're short of breath, and they have a heart murmur. Well, something's changed then. But if you've had it for 40, 50 years, and you've been told it's benign, it probably is benign.
Okay.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for your question. That's all the time we have today. And thanks for joining us. Join us again on Ask Dr. Zach.
Thanks to our studio audience for their questions and to you at home for watching. Remember, you can catch Dr. Zach as the house doctor on Zoomer Radio AM 740. I'm Eva D. Do take care, and we'll see you next time on Ask Dr. Zach.
Yes.
Why are you hiding all your years?
The makeup artist said I looked 22.
No. You said you had 4 kids.
I do.
You've been working forever. And you
Well,
looked
not forever.
18 or something.
You know what? Where's my mom? You have to see my mom. Mom! Sorry. She's turning 75. So I think that's where I get it. So I'm 42.
Your baby brothers.
That's where I hide them.
Sorry, I hope that wasn't a silly question.
Not at all.
I wanted to kind of lighten it up.
I don't get it. I used to get it a lot. Like, are you old enough to do that?
Yeah.
Recently, I don't know why, but.
What was the question? I said, where is he hiding his years? Because he said he has 4 kids.